The Americans repeatedly said that one of their key war aims was to remove Iran's ballistic missile capability. They've still got them. They can still use them.
They'd underestimated Iran. They'd underestimated the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But so far, the Iranians have done this better.
It now seems to be part of the negotiating process that you have a diplomatic agreement, you accept that there will be violations. It's as if bad faith has now become part of diplomacy. Hello and welcome to the Fourcast Indicators. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy.
And I'm Mark Urban, and this is the podcast where we look at the signals that analysts watch out for most closely, the telltale signs that suggest an imminent and significant change may be about to happen.
Today, Donald Trump says the ceasefire with Iran is over and that he doesn't want to deal with them anymore, calling its leaders scum after the US launched fresh strikes, with Tehran responding with attacks on American military sites in the Gulf, specifically Bahrain and Kuwait.
Add to that the US president saying he plans to hit Iran hard tonight. So what does this latest escalation tell us? Is diplomacy finished, or is this another turn in a conflict that's becoming increasingly hard to read?
Now, later, I'll be joined by Hossein Kanani Moghaddam, leader and founder of the Green Party of Iran, which sounds very gentle, but in fact, he is one of the founders of the IRGC. He was a former senior commander responsible for many of its operations internationally around the Middle East, and he's got some interesting views. But first, Mark, how do we judge this? What's your first indicator?
Yeah, well, I would say the things that really got my attention, and when we realised we had to go a day earlier than usual with this podcast, was before Trump spoke. And that was this escalation in the violence. Now, these cycles of Iran maybe attacking a ship or doing something else in a bid to exert their control over the strait, and then the Americans bombing them. We've had at least 4 of those cycles before. And the thing that really changed this last night was when the Americans suspended their waiver on Iranian oil exports. Now, the Iranians were using those waivers to get literally millions of barrels a week of oil out of the Gulf. So the cash was really flowing in again, and the Americans stopped that. And then lo and behold, today we see a hard Iranian strike on Kuwait and Bahrain, 2 allies. Quite interesting to analyse why them and not some of the others. US allies, the Iranians say it was American military targets, but I think we can assume a fairly broad range of targets, with dozens of Iranian strike weapons, including ballistic missiles. I think another sign there, sometimes when they're trying to show mild annoyance, they'll get militias in Iraq to fire some drones into Kuwait, that kind of thing. We've seen that in the past. But this ballistic missiles from Iran itself, indicating a willingness to escalate and to drive the conflict upwards, and almost to expose the fact that Trump wouldn't want to follow suit and do that. And of course, lo and behold, he has indicated that he might be willing to do that.
Yes, and he has to. And I suppose the Iranians are also very gleefully showing that when the Americans repeatedly said that one of their key war aims was to remove Iran's ballistic missile capability and its ability to produce more missiles, and that they had destroyed so many of their missile sites, they've still got them, they can still use them, and they can still target.
They have. And of course, for them, it's the thing we've seen since the first day of the war. Beating up America's friends in the Gulf is much easier than going after certain other types of targets. And lo and behold, there they are, those emirates and sheikdoms in the Gulf with their vulnerable infrastructure very close to Iran, much closer than Israel, with lesser means of defending themselves than the Americans or the Israelis have. And they say they fired over 80 missiles and drones at Kuwait and Bahrain over the last 24 hours. So quite a strong strike against them.
I mean, the big question is whether you have to take Trump at his word. When he says the ceasefire is over, the implication of that is that the memorandum of understanding is no longer in operation. We're not looking for talks. He was asked, do you prepared to talk? He says, he doesn't care. They're all scum. If you took him on face value, you would say, well, the whole thing has broken down. This is a return to war. But if you look at actually what's happened, it is again very targeted American strikes around the Strait of Hormuz, around Bandar Abbas, on the coast, where they're targeting military strikes. They're not yet hitting civilian targets the way they did during the war. And there's this hint that, well, yes, we can keep still talking. So it's actually very hard to read what this is.
No, you're absolutely right. And indeed, if one did the traditional military analyst business of looking at indicators, you'd say, I looked before I came in today, that the American carrier aviation and the other aviation is still pretty much all there. So very little has been trimmed back over the last couple of months. So they're good to go with quite a high level of airstrikes if they want to, the Americans. But do they really want to? Now, as you've detected, Krish, there's been some room for doubt in Trump's words. And what I find fascinating, it isn't, how many carrier-based aircraft of certain types they've got there within range of Iran. Those are not the critical things now. The critical thing now, I think, is the American appreciation that the only time they've really got back into the driving seat in terms of this loop of escalation, the so-called escalation dominance, as the military call it, is one time when there were strikes on infrastructure, but then, of course, the Iranians threatened to destroy all the desalination plants in the Gulf states. So that avenue was shut off. And then when they started the blockade of Iranian shipping in the Gulf and indeed Iranian ports outside the Gulf, and that seemed to bring, in a matter of weeks, a resumption of interest in negotiations from Tehran. In other words, the financial lever, the oil export lever, all that stuff. And we saw how significant that was last night. So now today, listening to the threats that Trump is making at the NATO summit in Turkey, what does he say? We're considering reimposing the economic blockade and hitting Iranian infrastructure. So in other words, whether it's through briefing or his appreciation of what happened over the past few months, he seems to be trying to threaten the pressure points that do get their attention.
So just to unpick for me escalation dominance, what it actually is, what the point is in terms of, each side showing how they can go to the next level and what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, well, so the theory is built around trying to think one or two steps ahead. And if you say, okay, well, if the US hits desalination plants, which Iran is not nearly as dependent upon as some of the Gulf states in terms of the percentage of water that comes from those, then of course Iran might also hit desalination plants in those Gulf states and very quickly bring about huge crises in some of them. So in that sense, on an issue like strikes against that type of infrastructure, you could say the Iranians have got escalation dominance, because where do you go from there if you're America and Iran does that? I mean, do you threaten them with nuclear weapons? I mean, nobody thinks that's going to happen. And indeed, Trump has actually ruled that out. So that's how they exert escalation dominance. The Americans did manage to, by blockading Iran and tightening various screws in terms of secondary sanctions in the Far East and doing various other things, to really close down the income they were getting from oil exports. The big question, of course, was why didn't they have the blockade ready from the start? Because they'd underestimated Iran, they'd underestimated the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. But so far, by and large, the Iranians have done this better. And of course, the big stroke was closing the Strait of Hormuz that put everybody else in a very difficult position, and having to choose either to escalate to that level of a sort of national mobilization really would be needed in the US to bring hundreds of thousands of service people there to the region, dozens more warships, hundreds more planes, to actually go and try and physically take the Strait of Hormuz or something like that. I mean, it would be the most enormous effort. And of course, America's not prepared to escalate to that degree. And that's why the Iranians, for a lot of this, have had it. But as always, the cash side of it is pretty important to Iran, I think. And the more it gets back to something that resembles normality, the more everyday concerns in Iran. I mean, you've been there.
Yeah.
You'll have to tell me the degree to which people feel the economic pressures, but they've got to keep the cash flowing.
I mean, it was a very interesting trip to Tehran, which I've done since we last spoke. And in terms of sort of the daily pressures on people, what it seemed clear to me that was happening was that the Iranian state was easing up on the morality pressures on the Iranian state, on women wearing headscarves, on people having parties where there might be alcohol, the kind of the middle class, lifestyle. And they were they're easing up on that, but they're very, very hard still on any kind of political dissent because they feel that they're in the ascendancy. And that was also very, very clear that just talking to ordinary people in the street who would not naturally align themselves necessarily with the government as was, but were furious with Trump, not with America as such. It's really interesting that a lot of Iranians have a sort of a warmth towards American popular culture, but furious about Trump, furious about the war, quite happy to align themselves with that sort of national unity. And I think the government were feeling that and have felt it in the last few days around the funeral of Ayatollah Khamenei. I think, had that been a different kind of death, we would have been analysing those scenes and saying, well, who's staying away? Who is actually delighted that he's dead? Instead, yes, there's no doubt there are lots of people who will be happy that Khamenei is gone, not least within the government, because there's a whole other generation of people who are now in power who wanted change, who wanted him out. But Iran, when I was there, and Iran, I think now that you're seeing these funeral images, is a lot more united around the idea that the American war is wrong and that they should resist it. And economically, it was very interesting. Food prices through the roof, 100% inflation, very, very difficult. But everything was in the shops. Everything's getting through. I've got a couple of pictures of convenience stores that I took in Tehran, which were just, the shelves were full. Now, people were not going in and buying a lot. What people were saying is, we are adjusting our spending so that we just go in and buy just what we need. We don't do a weekly shop in the way that we used to. But it's all there. And so there was no sense of this being a population that was buckling under the pressure, economically.
But do you think from their point of view, from the point of view of people trying to manage this crisis in the regime, this is actually quite a good time to stand tough because of that national unity factor that you mentioned. With the funeral, it's turned into a big national coming together in that sense.
Yeah, and as you say, they have calculated that the Americans don't want escalation more than they don't. That Trump cannot really commit to a full-scale return to war. And there was there's a sense amongst some of the people that we spoke to that there is a cunning to this whole peace plan with Iran, where it's not really about peace and friendship and a return to normality and a return to the international community. It is the end to what's happening, and then we will take control again, because we will have control of the Strait of Hormuz. And the agreement, that the memorandum of understanding giving Iran control of the shipping and their ability to make money through it, was seen with utter glee. They thought they'd won. So there was a real sense of, I think, we're in control of this, not the Americans, even though it may not look like that from the outside.
Here I think there's room for misperception and erroneous modelling of one another's ideas and intentions, because I think the Americans, for whatever the extreme language that Trump might have used, I think the people advising him have seen that the economic lever is key here. And that, yes, of course, you're right. The Iranians have now discovered the power of the Hormuz weapon. But the Americans have also seen that if they blockade all Iranian ports, they can have quite an effect on the Islamic Republic's ability to raise money. And, money has got to lubricate everything going forward over the next few months, and indeed, charging people for the Strait of Hormuz. isn't necessarily going to work if it all seizes up again.
Yes, but I suppose the hard thing is for the Americans to clamp down again economically and strangle Iran. They are almost certainly inviting what we're seeing now.
Yes, absolutely.
Which is military escalation as well. I mean, I wonder if this is a good place to bring in our interview with Hossein Kanani Moghaddam. Now, he's a really interesting guy. He was one of the founders of the IRGC. When I was in Tehran, he showed me his photo album, which had him with every Iranian leader. He was in Iraq. He was in Gaza. He has been in all the sort of the sphere, the axis of resistance for the IRGC. But he is now a civilian politician, and he leads the Green Party, which does have environmental concerns. But he himself is very much
on the military side.
A military side, but also sort of a hardliner. He's not really a compromise man. But I asked him a few minutes ago how he reads the situation now. Donald Trump says the ceasefire is over. How do you see what's happening today? Is the war back?
As you know, Donald Trump every time say joke, and he's a false man and madman. Sometimes say, okay, everything is ready for the ceasefire and peace. And after one lunch in the dinner, they say, no, everything is finished and the ceasefire is over and everything is final. I think that Donald Trump, he cannot open the Strait of the Hormuz because the memorandum between the Iran and the United States, they accepted the control of the Strait of the Hormuz before the 60 days under control of the Iran. And Iran announced a lot of time, just only one route for the transport of the ship and vessels and oil and gas from that route, because safe and security is under control of the Iran. But the United States tried to open the new route and channel for the north of the south of the Strait of the Hormuz, with escorted by the convoy and escorted by the Navy forces for past the vessels and ships. And many times the IRGC send a note to them. It is not safe for the transport of the oil and gas, but they denied, and they tried to open the new route for the this route.
Why is Iran trying to stop these ships passing? Everything was starting to move back to normal. Sanctions were reduced. The oil and gas was flowing. Why is Iran interrupting the flow of ships through the Strait of Hormuz?
This is the law of the memorandum meeting with the United States. According to this agreement, the control of the Strait of the Hormuz on the control of the IRGC and Iran. But the United States tried to change this law for an agreement. And that before the attack the Iran, the missile ship by the missiles in the Strait of the Hormuz, they canceled the sanction of the Iran oil, and they tried to back to the new sanction against Iran for the sold oil.
And do you think this is now going to escalate? Or do you think this is the way to bring the United States back to the negotiating table?
I think we have another war between the United States and maybe Israel as well, by the Iran. This escalation, I think the Trump tried to push the Iran to accept another condition for them. And I think if they want to use the NATO forces against Iran in Persian Gulf, I think this is a new war between the Iran and NATO and the United States and Israel as well.
You were one of the founders of the IRGC. You've had a long military career. There has been a pause in the war during the negotiations, and now seems to be a return to some kind of military exchange. Do you believe the IRGC wants escalation?
No, we don't like to escalate the war between Iran and the United States. But this reaction is a pinpoint system. The United States attack and they want to close the negotiation and the door of the negotiation. And IRGC answered just only to this reaction of the United States. And but we don't like to escalation of the war because the Persian Gulf is very important for the energy. And, Iran is a big exports oil and gas. And most of the budget of the Iran, some part of that is very important for us to prepare the money for the budget.
The Americans said that they had destroyed much of the ability of Iran to produce new ballistic missiles. And they've destroyed many of your radar sites and launch sites. How much of your missile capability do you still have?
We can continue. I think estimated that more than 3 years we have a capability and capacity for the attack against the base of the United States in this area. And at this time, all of my factory is producing and working for the product of the missiles. I think the United States cannot continue the war against Iran because, the economy of the war is very high cost for the United States.
Now, when we met in Tehran a few weeks ago, it was clear that many people in Iran felt emboldened by the situation. They felt that America had made a great mistake and that even people who didn't necessarily support the government were prepared to support it during the war. We have been watching the funeral of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in the last few days. And I wonder what you think is the current political situation in Iran in terms of unity. We know there are many people who didn't support the Ayatollah, who are glad he's gone. But how united do you think Iran is now?
People say we are ready to continue the war against any threat against Iran, for example, Israel or United States. I think some of the people, maybe they don't like to continue the war because they need economy activities and they need a facility for the living inside the Iran. And I think, but most of the people, more than 60, 100% of the people, they follow up the government at this time. Maybe before the war, 40 or 30% say, okay, we are follow of the government. But at this time, 60% is follow of the government.
So that's one view. And as I say, I mean, he is not really on the reformer side of Iranian politics. He's quietly spoken, but quite quite robust. What did you make of
the sort of person who has been empowered in that sense by this war, that sort of faction? Well, I thought that, I mean, it's a brilliant interview to get, Krish, and exploiting the connection you made there in Tehran. And so from my point of view, listening to him, I thought there were a couple of interesting points. The first is, you know, time and again, he talked about the idea that the Memorandum of Understanding had given Iran a sort of control or recognized. But, you know, the memorandum is very specific about the point, firstly, of free traffic for the first 60 days. But then Iran and Oman must together find the way to regulate and, if necessary, you know, charge for it.
Yeah.
And he didn't seem to be allowing for any Omani agency at all. And of course, a lot of these clashes that take place where the IRGC does go into action and launches things against ships are because they're going round through Omani waters. The other thing which I thought was quite striking about it was the way he almost talked up the role of the UK and France, because they have been involved in some mine clearing in Omani waters, and talked about Trump sort of using NATO. Now, of course, we know Trump would like to have more of a muscular response from NATO, but he hasn't got it. And of course, as we know, being in this country and watching things in France closely, neither the British nor the French want to be seen as joining in Trump's war in this context. But I did think it was interesting the way Moghaddam, you know, talked up the role of the Brits and the French.
I think that's an Iranian cultural legacy where they still think Britain is much
ever
more
since
important
1953
than it actually may be today. I mean, it takes us to NATO and the summit, I suppose. What do you think is actually going on there? Is this just performative Trump doing his thing?
Well, I mean, it's an extraordinary example, isn't it? Again, of the kind of world we live in, the scope for all kinds of escalation. I mean, you know, we could wake up tomorrow with another huge Russia versus Ukraine or NATO escalation, because that's coming to some kind of crisis point, given the effectiveness of those Ukrainian strikes on the Russian energy sector and on Crimea and everything else. But so what I expected was Zelensky to turn up and ask for help with defending himself from those Russian missile attacks, which of course is what he did. And of course for Trump to beard those who he didn't think were spending enough, which of course he did, particularly the Spanish and everything else. I mean, I thought it was a bit curious in the context of this struggle with Iran, you know, that he gave so much kudos to President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, of course, he's the host. And, you know, Trump may not observe the usual niceties, but you do tend to be polite about the host of a big conference like that. But, I mean, you know, Turkey was no more up for the US war on Iran than Britain and France were. In fact, arguably less so, and took its own actions behind the scenes to very much distance itself from America. And yet there was Trump really trying to bring Turkey back into the heart of NATO, all but promising them new F-35 stealth fighters, which some people, like the Israelis, really don't like that idea. But Erdogan really wants that from America, and it seems that Trump is willing to give it to him. So, yeah, those were all the kind of power political themes going on at the summit. That Erdogan was making the most of his leverage, and Trump was paying court to him in that sense. So I mean, that, yes, going forward and looking at how things might develop in the Middle East, if indeed America ever does manage to extricate itself to the degree it wants from the Middle East, we all know the contest is on to fill the vacuum. Clearly Iran in the lead in the Gulf itself, but Turkey trying to dominate the Levant, exploiting its close ties with the new government in Syria, etc., etc. So the Americans feel they have to have good relationships with them.
We should talk about Lebanon as well, I suppose, because, you know, while perhaps the world's media's attention pivots away, it is still, you know, very much a place of misery. And where does it fit in now in terms of Israel's campaign in Lebanon and its military ambition, and whether it could, in the light of these exchanges between the US and Iran, be another area of escalation?
Well, it's there, isn't it, as a cockpit for either Israel, if they want to escalate, or indeed Iran. if they want to suggest to Hezbollah that now would be a good time to fire some missiles into northern Israel, which has happened a couple of times since the 28th of February and the Israeli-American attack on Iran, so they can use it as a lever too. And of course, the poor old Lebanese government caught between the two. I mean, one had hoped, given the deal that was made in Washington between the government of Lebanon and Israel, that things were getting onto a more even keel there. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, we did see a strike yesterday in which I think 4 people were reportedly killed by an Israeli airstrike, that there are sort of well understood rules of the game now, that the south of Lebanon can still be a battleground at a certain level. And, there's aspects of that which Hezbollah like too. They do want to be able to carry on killing Israeli soldiers in pursuit of what they would say is liberation of occupied territory. But so long as the conflict does not go back into Beirut itself or missiles into northern Israel or drones or whatever, it can be contained at that level. But you're right. I mean, that's a fairly finely calibrated a state of affairs that could easily run aground, just has the carefully calibrated ideas about who should go through which part of the Strait of Hormuz have now been derailed, essentially by an Iranian attempt to stop people going through Omani waters.
I just wanted to also ask you, you're a long-standing diplomatic watcher, editor, correspondent. I mean, when you talk about the rules of the game, it seems to me that the rules of the game have changed a little bit as well in terms of what diplomacy is and what peace agreements are. Because we're now in a world in which peace agreements of course, peace agreements have always broken down, ceasefires have always been violated, but it now seems to be part of the negotiating process that you have a diplomatic agreement, you accept that there will be violations, and that's almost part of the diplomatic process going forward. That it's as if bad faith has now become part of diplomacy. Is that a deeply cynical view?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, when the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, in the Sunday Times, I called it an invitation to struggle, both in the immediate sense of that 60-day window, and that's what we've seen in the last 36 hours, is that struggle for control of the Strait of Hormuz getting out of control and swelling up. And then, of course, in the much broader sense, to what degree do the Iranians, for example, just regard this as a chance to pause, try and get the economy back onto a better footing, and then think over the next few years how they're going to do better against Israel in particular the next time they have a conflict with them? And of course, exactly the same in Israel. How are they going to come through another conflict with Iran if one happens? I mean, all sides, it seems to me, in the region think in those terms about readying themselves for the next war. Now, you said, is that an unduly cynical? I suppose, to me, it kind of reminds me of a lot of 19th century European politics and diplomacy where, and indeed even earlier than that, where the peace agreements were just regarded as moments to sort of preserve a bit of status, regenerate, repair the damage that's been done, and prepare for the next one, effectively. And this sort of mixture of politics, diplomacy, military force became very much the way of doing business. I mean, is that now the future for the Middle East? Clearly, for some countries, like the sort of Dubai model, where they were trying to project an image of stability, tourism, all kinds of carefree types of activity there, that's pretty disastrous. But I guess for the Iranians, Israelis, the others who regard these conflicts as existential, that's the way they'll see them, the chance to prepare for the next round.
That's a suitably cheery note on which to end.
I made the great mistake a couple of episodes ago of talking about how many ships were going through the Strait of Hormuz and saying, let's end on an optimistic note. So, I'm really a bit wary of striking another optimistic note, having been shown up now by what's been going on in the Strait of Hormuz the last 24 hours. But let's just hope for the best.
Until the next time, that's Fourcast Indicators. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.